reconstruct the pre-existing power structure or save the pre-existing power structure without intervening in any way. The way I see it right now is, however, we may be in a different kind of world. Put it this way, capitalism historically has grown at a 2.5% compound rate of growth since 1750, okay? And in good years, it's growing at 3%. Obama the other day said, well, in a couple of years, we'll be back to 3% growth. Gordon Brown says, well, actually, the economy will double in the next few years. Now, when capitalism was constituted by everything going on around Manchester and a few other hotspots in 1750, 3% compound growth forever was no problem. You're now looking at a situation where you're going to say 3% compound rate of growth on everything that's going on in East and Southeast Asia, Europe, North America, everywhere in the world. We're looking at a different kind of world. The total economy back in, say, 1750 was about $135 billion. It was $4 trillion by the time you get to 1950. It's $40 trillion by the time you get to 2000. It's now $56 trillion. If it doubles in the next year, we're talking about $100 trillion, and by 2030, you're going to have to find $3 trillion employment, if you like, profitable opportunities for capital to operate at that point. Now, there are limits, if you like, and I think we're hitting those limits environmentally, socially, politically. And I think it's time we started really thinking about an alternative. In other words, we have to think about a zero-growth economy.
What does that mean? It
means that instead of growing at 3% per year, you just keep it constant.
And how do you do that?
And that means it means it has to be non-capitalist, because that means there's not going to be any profit around for anybody to have. In effect, you're going to have a non-profit economy. And how you do that, of course, is a big, big question. And I don't have the blueprint for it, but I think that this is one of the key questions we should be thinking about right now. And what disturbs me is we're going through this crisis right now, and we're not asking those kinds of big questions that we should be asking.
What do you make of the massive protest against the, well, smallest percentage of the bailout money, which is going to the executives, certainly something people can identify with?
Well, I got upset about all this fuss about the AIG. I mean, we're talking about $165 million in bonuses, or 220. Last January 2008, the Wall Street bonuses collectively came in at $32 billion, okay? And at that time, 2 million people had already lost their houses. Figure, 2 million people have lost their houses. Wall Street rewards itself $32 billion. Nobody got angry about that, and I was extremely angry about that. It seemed to me this was class robbery. This is like the bankers going down into the hold of a sinking ship and grabbing all the gold and going up and getting on a lifeboat and then disappearing and then leaving everybody else on this sinking ship. And at that time, I thought that was outrageous. And that's $32 billion instead of this 165 or 235 million we're talking about. That money is already gone. I mean, when this guy wrote into the New York Times kind of saying, I'm just going to give mine away, he's going to give away $740,000 or something. And he said, but my family's not affected. But there are people starving right now in many parts of the world. Children are starving because of this, and nothing's happening about that. And
so what's the difference between last year and now?
The difference between last year and now is that actually the thing has got much worse. I mean, the toxic assets, if you like, become more and more apparent, and we've had, of course, the destruction of the investment banks, Lehman going bankrupt and the others merging, and so on. So I think the difference right now is that Wall Street is clearly having to completely reconstitute itself. But I don't think we should kid ourselves in thinking that actually there are not a lot of money, people still making good money on Wall Street. It's consolidated now, as it were. We've got 4 major banks left in this country, and it's a tremendous centralization and consolidation of class power.
Professor Harvey, what is neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism, for me, was a political project which formed in the 1970s. And it was a political project to try to consolidate and reconstruct class power. And it did it, if you like, through a whole kind of set of mechanisms about privatization, about free markets, individual responsibility, withdrawal of the state from social provision. But the state never withdrew from the economy. I mean, there's a myth that the state has been bailing people out all along. Actually, the savings and loan crisis I mentioned earlier, but as soon as the big guns get into trouble, the state bails them out. And this is what we call moral hazard. That actually, because you're bailing Wall Street out all of the time, then Wall Street will take high risks. And they've taken immensely high risks over the last 30 years, and again and again and again being caught out. And each time they get caught out, the state steps in and saves them. That's the connection, if you like, between the state and Wall Street, and that's a connection that has to be broken.
What do you see as the role of social movements?
I think right now it's a desperate moment, in the sense that if we're going to come out of this crisis in any different kind of way, it's going to be because of the formation of very strong social movements that say enough is enough. We've got to change the world in a very, very different way. Now, social movements of this kind don't sort of form overnight. They take a little while. I mean, it's interesting when you look back. In 1929, there's a stock market crash. The social movements didn't really start getting into motion until 1932, 33. It took about 3 years. Right now, I think we're in a legitimation crisis. They're trying to rescue the system as is, and I think more and more people are beginning to say this is an illegitimate system, and therefore we have to think about doing something different. Out of that, likely to come all kinds of different social movements. We have this movement, which is a relatively new movement, called the Right to the City movement. It's here in New York City, and it's several other cities in the United States. There's a national coalition. It's small right now, and it's getting its act together, but these kinds of things can grow very fast, very quickly. So there's likely to be many movements of that kind. In other countries, there are already quite massive social movements. This country is a little bit behind on that.
And what would you identify as those massive social movements elsewhere?
In Brazil, for example, there is a right to the city movement in Brazil around housing provision and dwelling and so on. There is a landless peasants movement in Brazil, which is very, very active and very successful in many of the things that it does. So those movements are really very strong. There's a peasant movement in India too, which is actually really quite strong. And so I think there's a real moment here where we also have to think about these things getting together globally, which is, of course, where the World Social Forum originated. And so there are ways in which we can start to think about coordination between different parts of the world.
Professor Harvey, how does war fit into this? U.S. still pursuing the war in Iraq, though President Obama says that we will eventually withdraw there, but expanding the war now in Afghanistan, not just 17,000 more troops, then another 4,000. That made it 21 today. The Pentagon asking for another 10,000 troops.
Well, interestingly, there's two aspects to this. First, since 1945, what you call the military-industrial complex has been a terribly important vehicle in American development. It has been the center of what we call military Keynesianism. I mean, it's the one sector where deficit financing was thoroughly permitted. And it was the one sector under Reagan that expanded immensely and has never been let go in spite of the end of the Cold War. So there's been a very important economic function to what the military is about. The second thing is that, as we've seen over the last couple of years, commodity prices are very unstable, and command over commodities and resources becomes absolutely crucial. So, in my view, a lot of the interventionism in the Middle East and elsewhere has been clearly built around the U.S. interest in controlling oil supplies. So it's not only about that, but it's very strongly connected with that. So that then arguments are made about, well, we've got to get rid of a dictator. Well, there have been plenty of dictators around the world the United States has not taken any notice of because they didn't control oil. And so the kind of war machine, if you like, and the covert machine starts to become very important in terms of maintaining corporate access to the resources of the world, and at some point also to the labor resources of the world, not only the natural resources.
How do you see the U.S. in relation to the rest of the world, the balance of power, U.S. versus Europe, U.S. and China? Do you see China emerging as the major dominant economic power?
No, I don't see it becoming the major dominant economic power. I think there was this National Intelligence Council report which came out last year. It kind of said basically the U.S. is no longer going to be the dominant power in the world. It's going to be a very important player in the world, but we have to look forward to a multipolar world in which East and Southeast Asia, for example, is economically as powerful as the United States. The European Union, if it gets its act together, is likely to be as powerful as the United States. So the United States has to look towards a multipolar world. That's actually both unstable and potentially rather dangerous. Whether we like what the US has done with its domination, at least there was only the US versus the Soviet Union kind of world. When you start to look at this multipolar world, you start to think back to what happened in the 1930s when the groups decided they were going to go it alone and got into economic conflict between each other. And I worry about the future.
What do you mean the groups?
At that time, the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, Germany with its own kind of interests, the British, and everybody was going it alone. And I think the threat of the G20 is what we're going to see as a sort of a fracturing of the global economy along those lines, and that could be a good